Welcome to the J3U University podcast. I'm your host, John Jewett.
And I'm your co-host, Luke Miller.
Our mission is to elevate the physique coaching standard
and deliver the highest level of competitors to the stage.
Let's jump into today's episode. Peak weekend water cuts. When should you be cutting water? Should everyone be doing it, or should only some people do it? Or what should be the cases that we actually run into this? And should it actually be a cut and more of an adjustment or manipulation? And so when I was at this last show, Luke, I had probably the most questions around what do I do with water? So it seems like a lot of curiosity around it. Also, there's probably a lot of confusion too around how much should be adjusted. And it is kind of like on a spectrum here. So that's what Luke and I are going to dive into, is what this spectrum looks like for adjusting water. And what we really teach in J3U is understanding the assessment part. And if you understand the assessment, then it's going to give you good insight into looking at different client cases and then the what to do. So athlete situations, maybe we should break them down.
Yeah. So
first,
as we kind of go into just a clarity's sake, before we head into these athlete situations, all of this is relative to a baseline hydration status that you've created coming into peak week. So we need to understand what that baseline hydration status is and have that well tracked so that we can go into this knowing what manipulations could potentially happen depending on where the looks the best for the athlete. Now, I think the most frustrating one to manage is the one where as you go through peak testing and you kind of see these different visuals at different times of the day, the individual looks their best fasted and starts to progressively get worse as hydration and food start to go through the day. I think this is even further aggravation when you have show times that are extremely late in the afternoon. And I think this is one that we could probably dive into pretty well, because this is probably the most adjustment off the baseline for me. And it's a tougher client situation to handle. Wouldn't you agree?
it is. I mean, you're going to have someone that is going to be more fluid restricted throughout a lot of time of the day. And I think you do bring up a good case of, like, we're talking about, I know, athlete situations, but should we maybe address the assessment part first? So you have that understanding. I was like, I'm jumping ahead of myself because because what we're about to talk about, it matters for the assessment. And you're right, Luke. So maybe to dial this back for everyone before we get into these athletes, is that for how we run our peak weeks is trying to make every day an assessment point of nearly planning out to what you're going to be doing showtime. Mm-hmm. And the goal of peak week is I'm trying to move individuals to consistent variables. That way I can have a really good gauge of what's happening. And then day by day, I'm trying to achieve them closer to a stage look.
Yep.
And the more locked in you have these variables going into your peak week, the easier it's going to be to move one lever at a time. And so just to say, what are you talking about, John? It's like, with the same food sources in place, the hydration schedule is already planned out for the day. So you have, like, I already like going into peak week with having how much water you're going to have with your meals, how much water you're going to have between your meals, and then total for the day. That way, when we get to one day out show day, I already know this information and I can easily adjust it versus, well, they were drinking 2 gallons per day. Now I'm going to split it out to this much per meal. But in reality, they were like getting it all in before bed or something, or getting it all in the morning, then tapering it in the evening. So I'll try to get, like, these type of variables set in place. I like to know also start looking at visuals very closely and scale weight very closely, as this is going to matter for when you get closer to this one day and show day time, to understand how someone is excreting water and dropping overnight, and then what that means for the visuals. So usually, like in our peak week planning, like, we'll have an AM visual with scale weight, a post-training visual and scale weight, and then a pre-bed or pre-last meal visual and scale weight. And through this, we're looking at after how many meals and how much fluid, as that progresses throughout the day, where are we seeing this athlete move to? And is it better or is it worse? For some people, it's better. The more fluid they get in and more food they get in. These are pretty tightly correlated, okay? So you almost don't have to think of them completely separate, because there should be a degree of scaling of water as food is increasing as well. And then what we're looking at for bedtime is also this change from bedtime to morning. So how much are they dropping overnight? And all this is going to help you kind of pre-plan as you get closer to one day out and show day, the meals and fluids that influence them, and then also where you need to be taking their body weight one day out to make sure they land on show day at that right look that you've kind of mapped and scoped out for during peak week. So through this is where we're going to have like these athlete situations that we're going to find of where someone's falling in these cases as we're moving through peak week. And I think that kind of helps give us a little bit more background, would you say, Luke, of before we get into the athlete situations. And another variable I should just mention before we get too far in here is that also, some people with fluids, they also confuse around sodium. And just, that's another variable, sodium, potassium, that I just like to keep very consistent. So going into peak week, I already have these variables high at a prep level to where I'm not going to have to shift them around until we're like the last moments of one day and on show day. You might make a consideration point here of like even like condiment changes. If someone's been using a lot of those, like non-nutritive sweeteners, like you might make a case like, hey, before we get a peak week, let's pull this stuff out. Like if you don't know the athlete, it's a first time through, just to remove all the variables that you're not going to be having consumed on show day. Like, are you going to have them pre-planning out? Like, make sure you have 2 tablespoons of mustard with this meal. Like, I don't know many coaches that do that. So there's kind of a question mark around what an athlete might be doing. And it might be best that you just go ahead and remove these items and account for just sodium or increasing salt in place of those condiments. But again, that's a athlete coach relationship management situation, but I wanted to bring it up. So, okay, let's get back to our number one, our first athlete here, Luke. The fasted look is the best look that we found on peak week. So someone that wakes up and they look like they could walk on stage right at the get-go, haven't eaten a thing, haven't drank a thing either. What does this situation look like for them as we get into show day?
I think one of the big things as a coach is noticing this pretty early. Like I've brought this up in the assessment piece before of asking for post-workout visuals and then having people report that within the peak week tracker, which a lot of times I'll do past the peak week, like it's a 10-day tracker, a 12-day tracker, whatever that might be, where you are seeing these changes in body weights for each point in the day that they're tracking, which for me is typically fasted, post-session, pre-bed, and then collecting some visuals across those different weights where you can start to be aware that, oh, this person looks much sharper and much better kind of upon morning or fasted visuals, right? From there, when we look at like how to manage this on show day, it's largely dependent upon where is their show time. And so one consideration that I think needs to be taken into account is how much sleep is that athlete going to be able to get in for the day, and how long are they going to be able to sleep relative to their stage time? Because when you have these afternoon like shows where it's tougher on this athlete in particular, sleep can be your best friend for extending or closing that gap between the afternoon. And then for me, then it's like managing a time duration now. So I more look at, as I'm going through peak testing, how long can I hold a visual from a time duration standpoint as I barely start to drip feed fluid and foods in. And that's the assessment piece that I start with before I go into building out what this peak will look like. And I think from there, we can start to say, what would hydration look like for this athlete kind of leading into show? And it's surprisingly going to be extremely low. I do kind of want to hear how you go about it, because I know we've done this a few times with a couple of different athletes. We both had this at Universe 2 years ago with athletes that woke up the best fasted and competed in the afternoon. So I think it's an interesting dynamic to run, but I kind of want to hear your thoughts on your first thoughts upon wake on show day.
Yeah, what I would say is like, if you had someone prior the day before, they had relatively their normal fluid intake, and you saw from 2 days to 1 day out, they wake up and you're like, okay, this is the drop I expect, and they can wake up ready. And it's almost this repeat of 1 day out of what you did for 2 days out. Some people might spur on of like, hey, I should pull a little extra water to where they wake up lighter, and then I can feed and give them fluids for more than what I was going to be able to on show day. I don't have a preference. I don't prefer that just because it's going to be a lot more to bring them back up. And especially when on show day, we have to make consideration that if I can get food lower and keep a smaller waist, that's also an ideal situation. I think holding someone within a 12 to 24 hour period of water restriction, you're not going to get much fight back here for counter-regulatory hormones. So if I have them wake up and they look nailed, I could easily hold that for the day without an issue. So what I would do in this athlete where, hey, I'm pretty cautious is just start with food first over fluids. Yep. Fluids go very far when you're changing an athlete. So food first, but fluids with that meal is what I typically would do. And so whatever I set, to have their normal rate of fluid intake, if it's 6 ounces with a meal, that's what they would start with. And then an hour later, I assess them. And I just kind of go from there. Did they improve? Did they get worse? And based on that, if you had a set food amount that you knew of what did the day before and they got worse, what changed? Fluid. Okay. So that makes an easy assessment point of what needs to change to improve them the opposite way is fluid. So then you would start, okay, between this meal, let's have this much fluid. Do we improve? Like 30 minutes later is what I would look at for fluid wise, because we're talking quick time here on stage sometimes. So giving a little bit of fluid every 30 minutes, kind of looking at them 30 minutes to 45 minutes. And then all of a sudden you're going to have how much fluid between a meal do they need to stay really close to this fasted look? Because keep in mind, a fasted look is only going to degrade throughout the day if you give someone zero fluid, and even with food in place. And this is the situation where someone's eating and they're like, man, I'm just not filling up, coach. Like I had like a 12 stack of pancakes, right? And then post show, they drink water and they're like, oh my gosh, I finally filled out. It's like, yes, water. Like you have to have some water. And it's also a situation where like someone start getting bloated just from food sitting in the gut without enough fluid to aid that digestive process. So that's kind of how I go about it. Like if the look's good in the morning, I don't like to overcomplicate it. Let's just keep trying to get close to that look meal by meal as we approach into prejudge.
Yeah, and I think the rate of fluid is an important one to pull out because I do it very similarly. So when I give that meal, I give a rate of fluid consumption. So like upon wake, assess, give that first meal, and I'll say like 6 ounces across the next hour so that it's spread pretty evenly and they're not like shoving it in. And I'm kind of seeing them as they spread that fluid intake out to basically try to simulate kind of the stability of fluid coming in at a certain rate, so that I can try to keep that rate constant if it's keeping them in a good spot, or adjust it up and down based on how much time to show that I have. The biggest thing with this athlete is minimizing what you have to do on show day. Like if you can have them waking up around where you want, that's always the best. Like trying to chase a 1% by pulling them down as hard as you can is typically never going to turn out very well, right? Unless there's like some constipation involved. I will say I tend to lean on 6 ounces per hour as like the bottom end range of the fluid rate of consumption. But once we get within that last hour for showtime, like it's starting to taper even more kind of into stage.
Thanks everyone for tuning in to today's podcast. Are you struggling to hit your peak on show day? Feeling lost in the off season? Upgrade your coaching game with J3 University. Our program covers everything from off season to contest prep to peak week, all based from real client results. Along with our comprehensive physique curriculum, you'll also get access to our 4 rooms with our J3U team to answer any questions you have, and live Q&A sessions to further your coaching and athlete experience. Performance. We are the source of education for top IFBB pros and coaches. Join us to elevate the coaching standard at J3U University. Let's get back to today's podcast. Yeah, body weight dependent, right? And also previous day dependent too, right?
Yeah.
If they're a large guy on 50 ounces between meals, like that's going to vary a lot, right? Versus the bikini athlete that was doing 30 ounces or something between meals. But
very much so.
I think with those cases, it can be easy to manage. It's just, that's the person you have to watch pretty close, because they can quickly degrade the look and get softer quick. Then you have to keep adjusting them back down, which is very possible. So, but you just have to keep an eye on them. I think our next situation, if you want to jump into that one, would be, I think a couple easier ones, we'll take a break from the hard one, is the midday look is nailed. So they hydrate. So we're seeing like this 2 day, 1 day out, like they wake up a little flat, but once they get like a couple meals in, their normal rate of fluid intake, we see that best look. So this sometimes for people is the post-training look. But then after that, more food and fluid, they start to get a little bit softer, a little too full.
Yep.
I think this is one of the easier ones to manage, with the exception if they're going on like a bodybuilder very early in the morning, and we normally get their best look kind of midday. And that's where it takes a little bit more management, but it's doable. So for this person, if you know on X amount of food and fluid, when their PM body weight gets to a certain amount, they drop so much overnight, right? So let's say they drop from 230 to 225, and we need to get them back to 227, that midday look where they look their best. Well, what we can do if they're going on earlier in the day is we can feed them a little harder up at night to 232, right? Or maybe that's a snack overnight with a little bit of fluids. So we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit for the day that's to come. Instead of waking up at 225, they're like 226. And now we have less food and fluid that we need to put in to get them on stage earlier on. Now that's the consideration though. It's like, well, when's their best look, their time of day for that? How much food and fluid was in, but also when are they going to go on a stage? And so it is nice if you can start shifting an athlete during peak week to train around the time where they would probably be going on stage to give you a gauge of that look, but it's not always the case. So as long as you have this framework of thought that we're talking about here, you're going to be able to shift this around. And then probably the anomaly, Luke, I don't think we need to spend much more time on that one because it's kind of an easier one. I think
it's super easy.
You let me know if there's not, but
it's really just the back end of the day, like making sure you reduce the rate of fluid consumption to hold the look. That's where it can get messy if you keep trying to hydrate them. So getting them off their feet, going to take a nap, hopefully seeing that body weight drop a smidge post prejudge, and then being able to kind of slowly reintroduce food and fluid. So that, I mean, depending on how much time you have between prejudge and night, right? But the reduction on the back end of the day is the important piece with that athlete.
Agreed. And basically the back end shifts to that first situation that we brought up, right? You're now like holding someone where we found like this kind of, it's almost like a fasted look for someone, but per se their best look. I think the rare situation here is when someone is just full and hard on nearly any amount of food and fluid all day long. Usually they'll probably wake up a little flat, but they just only keep getting better. And the amount of condition fades very slightly. And you're probably like, Luke, I never have a client like this. What are you talking about? But there's ones there where they're so conditioned that you could put them on stage at almost any moment of the day. They could compete at a high level. And
I have a girl like this now. Yeah, I have a girl like this now. So shout out Wendy. She's a WPD athlete. She's doing Universe next week. What I find with this is the weight range is much larger. Like the weight range of the best look is much larger that you can put this athlete on the stage. She's one of those ones that 114 fasted and 117 and a half is like almost identical conditioning wise with just more fullness. It's like very slight blurring. And it's like, I could fall asleep and peak this woman, but it's good because the work on the prep was done on the front end, where I saw this happen with the peak testing that's been happening leading into the show, where it's like, no matter what time she goes on stage, I just know that, again, I'm going to be able to kind of feed her into whatever look I like. I want to bias. I will say with these athletes, I will lean, like if we think of a weight range, let's talk about a 4-pound weight range. I often lean towards the fuller side of the spectrum to try to hold it throughout the day. It's like get them there and hold, so that it's not like I'm having to constantly feed them. So like I'm doing that the day before. It's like waking them up close to that weight, get them to that weight, and then hold, so that it's not like I'm having to shove so much food. Because what I do find with this athlete is if waste control. If you don't feed them or keep them up, they will go quick on you. Like they'll start to go below that weight range that you like, even though like pretty much they look good most of the day.
Yeah, I think here's where you mess up this with this athlete, is that you want to cut water. And I think
yes, exactly.
You're like, how much more can I pull out? Like I shouldn't do the same thing as we all just need to cut water, because that's what we do as bodybuilders. And that's where you mess up, is you don't go off your previous day's data to where, man, if they're normal fluid intake, they just look phenomenal. Why would you change how they look from that? Right.
Yeah.
Remember at Universe, like this was Daniel Coffey, our posing coach, like
coach. Yeah.
203 fasted. I fed him all the way to PM up to 210, and he still has glute lines in. He just looked fuller. So it's like, well, okay, we have a big range. I think he went on stage around 207, 208, which was the balance. Cause it's like, well, super full. Do I want to sacrifice? How many lines do I want to sacrifice here? But you have a lot of flexibility with someone like that. If it's a pro show where you kind of know the lineup and who's showing up, like, is there some really conditioned guy coming?
You can bias it.
Yeah, maybe you do bias, but you never know. So truly it is what catches your eye off these visuals when you're looking across someone's, pictures of the day. And to go back to the assessment piece for these individuals, like that 1 day out mark, that's visual and weights meal by meal. Even 2 days out is what I like to see. So we can catch that weight scale of how it moves across the day with meals and fluids. So especially with this athlete, it's important to map that out, so you know where they land. But I guess we'll jump back to hard situations, because that's easy. But the hard one is where someone never is conditioned on peak week. It's like you never find that look of like them waking up in the morning like, oh yeah, they could walk on stage like this. Then they only get softer when you add food and you add fluid. And this is probably the person where you needed more body fat off. Where we see a lot of these cases. And you have to make a rationale of that. Well, is this someone where if I dehydrate them a little bit and I adjust a little bit of water, will that bring it a little bit more condition in, worth the trade-off of a loss of some fullness? And because everyone can be out of shape and full, but the more condition you have, it could be beneficial. This is a situation where you might have to weigh out if it's worth it or not. And it's one that's hard to pre-test, because you're not going to have someone that was ready ahead in this situation. And also, you're basically having to run their first peak and see how it goes. And then it's probably the second show is where you might be able to fine tune this more and decide if that was worth it or not. So this is more so just the not ideal situation. I think this is when you've also tried to weigh out if you're an enhanced bodybuilder, is this, PD related, or what could it have been? And if you see someone where like a lot of the other parts of their body look grainy, but they have this softer kind of gushy look in just certain body parts, that might be the person where it's worth exploring, manipulating water a bit more, and adjusting it 1 day out to where they wake up a further dehydrated state. Mm-hmm. And the worst case is that hopefully they're not going on early and you have time to bring them back up if it was a worse look. Do you handle that situation any different, Luke?
I would agree with kind of all of this. I think where people tend to promote the water cut situation so much is because a large percentage of athletes don't get all the way to condition. And so they see a water cut, slight dehydration, and or anything that improves diuresis or increases diuresis, not improves. It improves the look because they're dehydrated, because they're not all the way in contest shape. And I think that's where this like echo chamber of water manipulation has to happen in whatever form that you want to talk about it, right? Whether it's diuretic usage or water loading or whatever. It's that just people simply don't get into shape, because this is the case where you might potentially see a small improvement in the visuals with that pulling down of the water. And it's probably the only case in which I'll do heavy water manipulation. And I honestly, man, I think though, like at this point, I just tell the athlete they probably shouldn't be doing the show. That's just where I'm at in my career though. Right. So, I mean, I get like early coaches, like you're trying to put any athlete that you can on stage and try to get wins. So this might be the case where you have to do that, but you're basically chasing as low of a body weight as you can get to by the time of show day, because that's probably going to be the best visual that you can find for this athlete that's not fully all the way there.
Yeah. And it's a case too, like, hey, don't go extreme with it, because the worst situation ever is, for one, you're fat on stage, but also you're flat. So you have the combination of the worst, right?
Yeah.
Small muscles and body fat. Like, it is the exact opposite of what you want on a bodybuilding stage. So, you bring them down and you watch your scale weight. It's like, okay, their visuals look softer and their body weight's down. That means they're flat. Bring them back up so you don't put someone on stage that's fat and flat at the same time. The other situation where this happens, it's a triage situation where a athlete, they've been perfect, right? Like 2 days out to 1 day out, you're like, yes, we get a meal in or whatever, where they go on stage like this. Then you see their pics on show day and you assess them. You're like, oh my gosh, what happened? Their body weight didn't drop as much. They look way softer. It's a situation where maybe they got stressed out. Maybe they didn't sleep that night. Maybe they got up and binged. Stuff like this happens. Rare cases of like menstrual cycles starting for females, right? So all this leading to just some less diuresis happening overnight, and now we're in this softer state. So this is just a triage situation in the morning of what to do and where you can get them back to the best that you can. If body weight's higher, we're going to know, well, less water and food needs to be intact to start excreting some of that. Yep. So that's kind of the preface around like, hey, what needs to happen? Probably some type of pump work, going through some poses, seeing if they're improving doing that, watching them close, and trying to just get them have some fasting time and some rest as well, some relaxation time to start excreting some of that water and get them down. So that's a tough situation. This is a cases where people might bring up, cases for certain type of diuretics being in place. And on this note, I should bring up, which I didn't last on a lot of these cases, is with water reductions on show day. And why I mentioned it earlier is keeping sodium up. Don't also drop your sodium, or you're also in for a double whammy of extra water excretion and getting someone really flat on stage. Like, sodium is how you'll maintain some fullness and pop in the muscle and ability to contract while water's going down. And so I actually like on show day bringing sodium up a degree as I'm bringing water down. And man, the look can be very, very good doing that. So just a caveat around that. So someone using diuretics, I see it can be a mess, man, with lowering sodium and water, taking diuretic, and then it's a triple effect. And this is where we run into dangerous situations. So overall, I don't put out and recommend that, but it's something that you might see done. And so you listen to this podcast and realize, oh yeah, John and Luke, this is what they said about the triple whammy of what you shouldn't do. But
yeah, and I think interesting too is like, even if you just keep sodium at a baseline, sodium relative to fluid intake is higher from a hydration status standpoint, where I do see that you tend to get that same effect of like that slight increase, where you could probably hold it at the same intake or have a slight increase of sodium with that reduction in fluid and see a similar response, because like hydration status is a relative ratio of fluid and sodium, typically also potassium as well. But by holding sodium at baseline, that water reduction still creating that higher sodium environment relative to fluid, right? So I think it's more about, and this is where getting in true contest shape just makes this almost foolproof. Like there's no need for anything that increases diuresis. Like your dandelion root that you're taking on peak week is just, might as well just throw it in the trash bin, because there's probably not much use for it if you're in true contest shape. Like just get to the place where it's predictable with the fluid and sodium amounts that you need with this amount of food with that fluid to land it predictably. And then you can just move things up and down to push someone depending on that last sleep heading into the show. Because you'll wake up where some people don't drop or they drop more. Like it's like you finally see the fatigue realization and they drop 7 pounds instead of 4. It's like, okay, hydration's got to come in a bit quicker, probably a bit more food. We need to push them back up, right? So it just makes adjustments when things happen that you don't expect super easy, because you know where that baseline is.
Yeah, and on that point, I think there is this final athlete to bring up that is the competitor, like you're saying, Luke. Like as we go through peak week, they're waking up lighter and the visuals only keep improving. Mm-hmm. And usually it's fatigue drop, so there's less inflammation there. Maybe we're having some trade-off in glycogen increase as well, but netting a lowering of scale weight, but they get harder and harder. You're one day out, they wake up and they're like, man, they dropped again. They only look better. It's like, should I do a little more to drop them again with water manipulation? Like, is that going to be worth it? And I think that's where we're trying to pull an extra 1% out, but you're more liable to lose 10 to 20 in the actuality in many cases. And so I think if you have this person where they're only getting harder and harder, go off that data. Like if they're only improving day by day with what you're doing, they could probably wake up on show day and still have that same carryover effect that's been occurring without you now changing another variable, which might push them too far. So again, like the assessment needs to take place here, and before you try to pull too much out of someone. So I think we could probably wrap this up with just some final thoughts, unless you have another athlete situation that I'm not thinking of.
No, I really love to look at this as like time duration relative to rate of hydration. I think it makes it the most predictable way to do it, because you're going to have athletes. And I think this might be from a place that I do have a fair chunk of athletes that are just not coaches themselves and don't run like a flexible schedule. So they're having to consistently train at times where the post-workout data is maybe not super specific to the data that's going to be on show day. So like they're going on stage at 10 a.m., but they work till 5. And so their post-workout pictures are at 7:30, right? So using a weekend to get some data closer to that, then looking at that time duration of rate of fluid intake, sodium intake relative to the time from wake to the time of on stage, is allowed me to make peaks so much more predictable, because I can string along that rate of hydration at the same pace that their gap from wake to showtime is for that athlete.
Yeah. I think that's a good takeaway. And just also reiterating that during peak week, just track the data, track all these visuals, scale weights and meal times, so you can make informed decisions on what you're doing, and you're not just trying to wing some XYZ protocol that we're pulling from somewhere. It should be based on all the data that you've been using to prep this client, to where you have more predictive results based on what we've been doing on plan versus a roll of the dice, which is usually where end up people just missing the mark completely. So, the simple question to look at this, confusing if it is like, from their PM to their AM look, are their visuals getting harder or flat, right? So if they're getting harder, then a water reduction probably doesn't need to happen if they keep improving during your peak week. If they're starting to get flatter every morning, well, now you're going to know, like, okay, this athlete's going to probably need more water. And then if we have that athlete where they're never there or they're soft, likely we need to have conversations around, should we be doing this peak week and what are the shows to come? And maybe there's a situation for some water reduction to take place, but watch your athletes meal by meal, collect the data, and that's going to be your best way to inform yourself if you should be cutting water or you shouldn't, or just manipulating it slightly. It's a range. Realize that. And everyone's going to have a slightly different look to that range. So you're not going to come to J3U and get our water manipulation protocol. You're going to get this frame of thinking to assess your client. So, for that individualized person, what they're going to be best with for managing hydration on show day. If you'd like to know more about this, you know where to head to j3university.com or work with the J3U coach, where this is what we do. We assess and we build out your personalized peak week strategy for you. No copy paste protocols, right?
Yeah.
So anyway,
Until next time.
Any questions, comments, leave them down below, and we'll talk to you next time.